A calm flight took a shocking turn when a flight attendant accused a couple of wrongdoing and called security, but just minutes later the tables turned in a way no one saw coming, leaving the entire cabin speechless. What really happened during those 710 minutes before we start the story? Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. A flight attendant stood at the center of a growing commotion in the first class section of a bustling airplane. Passengers, many still settling into their seats, turned their heads as voices escalated. The tension was undeniable, thick enough to pause conversations and pull gazes toward the source of the dispute. A couple, James and Carla, both dressed with effortless sophistication, sat quietly as the flight attendant loomed over them, her expression a mix of authority and impatience. James, a tech entrepreneur, and Carla, a well-known lawyer, had boarded the flight with their usual calm and confidence. They had been looking forward to a brief getaway, leaving behind their demanding schedules for a weekend of rest. Their tickets, first class and booked weeks in advance, had been scanned at the gate without a single issue, but now, as they tried to settle in, their moment of peace had turned into an unexpected challenge. The flight attendant, Linda, held a notebook in her hand, but her focus was fixed on James and Carla. Her tone, while measured, carried a clear edge. "I'll need to see your tickets again," she said, her voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. James calmly handed her his boarding pass, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. Carla, sitting beside him, handed hers over to her, hands steady despite the growing murmurs around them. Linda glanced at the tickets, her frown deepening. She flipped them over, checked them again, and handed them back with a curt nod. "I'll be back," she said, and walked briskly toward the galley, leaving behind an air of unease. Carla glanced at James, her voice low. "This doesn't feel right," she said. James nodded, his jaw tightening. Just stay calm," he replied. "We've done nothing wrong." But staying calm was as easy as it sounded. Passengers nearby began whispering, their curiosity piqued. One man seated across the aisle leaned slightly toward James. "Everything okay?" he asked in a low voice. James gave a small nod and replied, "It's fine," but the man's furrowed brow suggested he wasn't convinced. As minutes passed, Linda returned, this time with an air of finality. She leaned slightly toward the couple, her tone colder. "Now I'm going to need you both to come with me. There seems to be an issue with your seating," she said. Carla's eyes narrowed slightly, but she remained composed. "Our tickets are for these seats," she said firmly. "There shouldn't be any issue." Linda straightened, her face hardening. "We can sort it out in the galley," she said, gesturing toward the back of the plane. The murmurs around them grew louder, but James stood, his movements deliberate and calm. Carla followed, her chin raised slightly as she picked up her bag. The aisle seemed to stretch endlessly as they walked, passengers turning their heads to watch them pass. Linda led them to the narrow space near the galley and folded her arms. "There's been a mistake," she said flatly. "These seats aren't yours." Carla tilted her head, her voice calm but firm. "Our tickets were scanned and confirmed at the gate. There's no mistake." Linda didn't falter. "I'm going to have to involve security if you don't cooperate," she said. James glanced at Carla, his expression unreadable. Slowly he pulled his phone from his pocket, holding it firmly. "Before you do that," he said quietly, "you should make sure you know what you're doing." Linda's frown deepened, but her gaze wavered slightly. Back in the first-class cabin, the tension was palpable. Passengers whispered to one another, glancing toward the galley where the couple had disappeared. The man who had spoken earlier crossed his arms, his face set in a deep frown. "This doesn't feel right," he muttered to himself. Meanwhile, Linda's tone grew sharper as she repeated her demand, but Carla stood her ground, her voice steady. "I think it's time we called someone who can help clarify the situation," she said, pulling her phone from her bag. James watched her with a small nod, his expression calm but focused. The murmurs in the cab grew louder as passengers exchanged worried glances. Some leaned into the aisles to catch a glimpse of what was happening near the galley. Linda's frustration became more evident with each passing moment. Ma'am, I've already explained the issue, she said firmly, though her voice carried a hint of nervousness. Carla, however, remained composed, dialing a number on her phone with quiet determination. James stood slightly behind her, his phone now recording the interaction. This is unacceptable, he said, his tone calm but resolute. We're not going to be moved unless you provide a valid reason. Linda stiffened her posture. Rigid. Sir, I don't have to explain myself further, she snapped. If you refuse to comply, I'll call security. Carla pressed the phone to her ear and waited a moment before speaking. Hello, she said, her tone professional but unmistakably firm. I'm on flight 387 first class. My husband and I are being told we cannot remain in our seats despite holding valid tickets. Could you assist us with this matter? James caught a subtle shift in Linda's expression as Carla spoke. Confusion, perhaps even doubt. Linda interrupted sharply. Who are you calling? I told you this is a security matter. Carla ignored her calmly, continuing, yes, we're still on the plane. I'll send you a quick text with the details. She ended the call, her movements deliberate and unhurried, and began typing on her phone. Linda's patience was clearly wearing thin. This isn't going to change anything, she said, her tone now laced with irritation. Meanwhile, back in the first class cabin, a man in a suit leaned over to a flight attendant named Clara who had been quietly observing the situation. This doesn't seem right, he said under his breath. Clara nodded slightly but didn't respond. Bond, her eyes flickering toward the galley, she seemed hesitant, as though debating whether to intervene. Moments later, Linda turned abruptly and walked toward the phone mounted near the galley wall. Passengers craned their necks to see what was happening as Linda made the call she had threatened. This is Linda. First class cabin, I need security at gate 12 immediately, she said into the phone, her voice brisk. We have two passengers refusing to comply. Carla and James exchanged a glance. Carla's expression didn't change, but James raised an eyebrow slightly, the corner of his mouth twitching as though he were holding back a reaction. Linda hung up and turned back to them, arms folded tightly across her chest. They'll be here shortly, she said. I suggest you cooperate before this escalates further. But Carla remained calm, slipping her phone back into her bag. Wait, she said simply, her tone neutral. Her response seemed to settle Linda, who hesitated for a brief moment before walking back into the first class cabin, likely to update her colleagues in her absence. James finally broke the silence. What did they say? He asked Carla. She looked at him, her expression steady. They're working on it, she said quietly. Let's just give it a few more minutes. James nodded, leaning against the galley wall as the sound of approaching footsteps from the cabin signaled Linda's return. Linda returned to the galley, her face set in a mask of forced confidence. Behind her, the hum of the plane grew quieter as passengers watched the unfolding drama with increasing interest. Clara trailed a few steps behind Linda, her expression a mix of concern and hesitation. Security is on the way, Linda announced, her voice loud enough for others to hear. I suggest you both prepare to leave the plane. Carla glanced at James, her calm demeanor unshaken. That won't be necessary, she said. Her voice was soft but carried a firmness that stopped Linda mid-stride. Clara shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between Linda and the couple. Linda, Clara began cautiously. Maybe we should check with the captain first. It might help if I've got this. Clara, Linda interrupted sharply, her tone clipped. Clara stepped back, her lips pressing into a thin line, but her eyes lingered on James and Carla with an unspoken apology. James, high, pulling his phone back out and checking the screen. 7 minutes, he murmured mostly to himself. Carla caught his eye, her lips curling into the faintest smile. Patience, she whispered, her tone steady. Linda seemed to sense that something was off. Her earlier confidence began to waver, her gaze darting between the couple and the curtain leading to the first class cabin. You can record all you want, she snapped, addressing James directly. It doesn't change the fact that you're in violation of what Carla interjected smoothly. The interruption caught Linda off guard. Carla continued, her voice even. We've Shown you our tickets which are valid. We've remained calm and cooperative. You on the other hand have escalated this situation unnecessarily. What violation are you referring to exactly? Linda's jaw tightened. It's not about she began but she didn't finish. Instead the phone on the galley wall buzzed, cutting through the tension like a knife. Clara moved instinctively to answer but Linda held up a hand to stop her. I'll get it, she said, though her voice had lost some of its edge. She picked up the receiver, her posture stiff. This is Linda, she said. Her eyes flickered briefly toward James and Carla as she listened. Whatever was being said on the other end of the line made her expression harden, then falter. Yes sir, she said finally, her voice quieter now. Understood. Linda hung up the phone and stood motionless for a moment, her back to the couple. Clara took a cautious step forward. What is it? she asked softly. Linda turned around slowly, her face pale. The captain wants to see me, she muttered, her tone now subdued. Without another word she brushed past Clara and disappeared through the curtain, leaving the couple standing in the galley. Clara hesitated, then approached James and Cara. Is there anything I can get you? she asked quietly, her voice warm but tinged with unease. Carla gave her a reassuring smile. Thank you, Clara, she said. We're fine for now. Clara nodded and stepped back, her unease evident as the moment stretched on. The passenger seated nearby began whispering again, their voices a low murmur of speculation. James leaned against the wall, his phone still in hand, while Carla crossed her arms and looked out the small galley window. Neither spoke, but the faint knowing glances they exchanged spoke volumes. The clock was ticking and they both knew it. Linda walked briskly toward the cockpit, her mind racing as she replayed the phone call. The captain's tone had been firm, leaving no room for argument. When she reached the cockpit door she took a deep breath before knocking lightly. The door opened and Captain Harris, a seasoned pilot with years of experience, greeted her with a neutral expression. Step inside, he said, his voice calm but authoritative. Linda obeyed, stepping into the small space. The co-pilot nodded briefly in acknowledgement before turning back to the controls. The captain gestured for Linda to take a seat in the jump seat near the door. We need to talk about the situation in first class, he began, his tone steady but unmistakably serious. Linda fidgeted with her hands, trying to maintain her composure. Captain, I'm handling it, she said quickly. The passengers in question refused to comply and I called security to resolve the issue. The captain's eyes narrowed slightly. Refused to comply with what exactly, he asked. I reviewed their tickets myself after the call from headquarters. Both are valid first-class tickets and I see no reason why they shouldn't be seated where they are. Linda froze, the weight of his words sinking in. I thought there was a mistake, she stammered. They didn't seem. She stopped herself, realizing too late that she had no reasonable explanation for her actions. The captain's expression hardened. You thought wrong, he said sharply. We've received a direct call from the executive office regarding this incident. Those passengers are not only within their rights to remain in first class, but one of them, Mrs. Carla, is well connected to the airline leadership. Linda's stomach dropped. Connected to the leadership, she repeated weakly. The captain nodded. And she's already reached out to them about what's happened here. They've requested a full report and they want to know why the situation escalated to this point. You should also know they've instructed me to prioritize the comfort and dignity of those passengers for the remainder of this flight. Linda felt a chill run down her spine. I didn't know, she muttered, her voice barely audible. That much is clear, the captain said, his tone cold. You acted on assumptions rather than facts, and now we're in a situation that could have serious consequences for this airline. You'll return to the cabin and make no further decisions regarding those passengers. Do I make myself clear? Linda nodded slowly, her face pale. Yes, Captain, she said, her voice hollow. The captain dismissed her with a curt gesture and Linda left the cockpit in a daze as she made her way back toward the first-class cabin. Her thoughts swirled with panic. She hadn't just misjudged the couple, she had misjudged the entire situation. Her authority, once a shield, now felt like a fragile mask that could crumble at any Moment when she re-entered the first-class section, passengers watched her closely, some exchanged glances, sensing that something had shifted. Linda kept her head down, walking straight past the galley without making eye contact with James or Carla. For the first time her confidence was gone, replaced by an uneasy silence that spoke louder than any words. Back in the galley, James glanced at Carla with a subtle smirk, but neither spoke. The silence between them was filled with unspoken understanding. Clara lingered nearby, pretending to busy herself with the drink cart but keeping a watchful eye on the couple. Her genuine concern was evident, though she didn't dare voice it aloud. Moments later a soft chime sounded through the cabin, a signal that usually went unnoticed, but this time it seemed to carry weight, a quiet prelude to what was about to unfold. Clara glanced up instinctively, and the curtain leading to first class rustled as Linda emerged, her face pale and drawn. Her usual brisk movements had slowed, and her shoulders were slightly hunched, as if the weight of the captain's words had physically pressed down on her. Linda stopped just short of the galley, hesitating for a moment before approaching James and Carla. Her expression was tight, a mixture of forced professionalism and lingering discomfort. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, she began, her voice lacking its earlier sharpness, I'd like to apologize for any inconvenience caused earlier. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. Carla met Linda's gaze steadily, her face unreadable. A misunderstanding, she repeated, her voice soft but carrying an unmistakable edge. Linda flinched slightly, her confidence unraveling further. Yes, Linda said quickly, as if rushing to fill the heavy silence. It appears there was an error on my part. I assure you it won't happen again. James tilted his head, watching Linda carefully. You've made quite an effort to remove us from our seats over an error, he said. His tone was calm, but there was a sharpness beneath it that made Linda visibly uncomfortable. Carla leaned back slightly, her arms crossed. We appreciate your apology, she said simply, though her tone suggested it wasn't nearly enough. But I hope you understand that this situation has gone far beyond a mere inconvenience. Linda nodded stiffly, the tension in the air almost unbearable. Of course, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'll make sure everything is taken care of for the rest of your flight before either James or Carla could respond. Clara stepped forward, her movements hesitant but purposeful. Would you like something to drink, she asked quietly, her voice warm. Maybe some water or tea. Carla's expression softened slightly as she turned to Clara. Thank you, she said, a glass of water would be fine. Clara nodded and quickly retrieved a glass from the drink cart, setting it on the small tray in front of Carla. If there's anything else you need, please let me know, she said, her sincerity evident as Clara stepped away. Linda lingered for a moment longer, as if debating whether to say more, but the weight of the couple's calm but firm responses seemed to hold her in place. Finally she muttered another apology and retreated toward the first-class section, her steps quicker now, almost as if she were fleeing. James and Carla exchanged a glance, their expressions unreadable. They didn't need to say anything. The dynamic had shifted, and it was clear that Linda was no longer in control of the situation. James checked his phone again, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light of the galley. Any minute now, he said quietly, his voice tinged with anticipation. Carla nodded, taking a small sip of her water. Let her sweat, she replied, her voice calm but resolute. She has no idea what's coming next. Linda hurried back to the first-class section, her mind spinning. She could feel the eyes of passengers following her there, silent judgment cutting through her already fragile composure in the galley. James and Carla remained seated, their expressions calm yet unwavering. The tension in the cabin had shifted, and it was no longer in Linda's favor. As Linda reached the galley in first class, Dennis, the senior flight attendant, approached her. His demeanor was calm, but there was a sharpness in his gaze. Linda, he began in a low voice, the captain just radioed in. We've received another call from the ex-executive office. They monitoring the situation closely. Linda's stomach twisted. What does that mean, she asked, her voice cracking slightly. Dennis folded his arms. his tone growing firmer. It means they're not happy, Linda. They've asked for a detailed report of your actions during this flight and the captain has made it clear there's no room for further mistakes. Linda's face piled as she leaned against the counter. I was just doing my job, she muttered defensively. Dennis shook his head. Was it your job to call security on 2 passengers with valid first-class tickets? You've put us all in a very difficult position. Back in the main cabin, James and Carla sat quietly, their calm composure masking the storm they had set into motion. Carla glanced at James, her voice low but steady. Did they respond yet? James checked his phone, then gave a small nod. They're ready, just waiting on the next move. Carla leaned back, her confidence unshaken. Good, she said. It's time they understand who they're dealing with. At the same time, the murmurs among the passengers grew louder. The man who had earlier spoken to James leaned toward a nearby woman, whispering, "Do you think they'll actually call the police? This is getting ridiculous." The woman shook her head, her expression disapproving. They shouldn't even be dealing with this. That flight attendant clearly has something against them. The quiet discontent among the passengers began to ripple through the cabin. More and more people were glancing toward the galley, whispering to each other about what they had witnessed. Linda, now fully aware of the growing tension, tried to ignore the stares as she busied herself with meaningless tasks. Then the phone in the first-class galley buzzed again. Dennis picked it up, this time his expression unreadable as he listened. When he hung up, he turned to Linda, his tone serious. "It's the captain, he wants to see you again." Linda froze, her breath catching in her throat. "What now?" she whispered, but Dennis only gave her a hard look. "I think you know," he said simply. Linda hesitated, then walked back toward the cockpit, her steps slower this time. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her earlier decisions pressing down on her. Behind her, the whispers of the passengers grew louder, like an unstoppable tide of judgment that she couldn't escape. Linda reached the cockpit door, her heart pounding in her chest. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the handle before she finally knocked. The door opened and Captain Harris's expression was even sterner than before. He gestured for her to step inside, his demeanor leaving no room for argument. "Linda," he began, his tone sharp and direct, "I've just received another call from the executive office. The situation has escalated beyond what I can manage on this flight. Headquarters is now fully involved and they've issued a direct order." Linda swallowed hard, her throat dry. "What kind of order?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The captain leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "Effective immediately. You are to be removed from this flight. Security will escort you off the plane once we land. Your actions have not only disrupted the passengers, but they've also drawn the attention of our highest leadership. They're demanding accountability and they've decided to start with you." Linda's breath caught in her throat. "You can't be serious," she stammered, her voice rising. "I was just following procedure." "Enough," the captain interrupted, his voice cold and firm. "This isn't about procedure, this is about the choices you made, the assumptions you acted on, and the unnecessary chaos you've caused. There's no excuse for what you did, and now the airline is facing consequences because of your behavior." Linda's face turned pale, her hands trembling. She opened her mouth to argue, but the captain raised a hand to silence her. "This decision is final. Return to the galley and complete your duties until landing. Once we're on the ground, security will handle the rest." Dismissed. Linda left the cockpit, her legs feeling like they might give out beneath her. The whispers from the passengers seemed louder now, and every glance in her direction felt like a judgment she couldn't escape. Her mind raced with panic, trying to process what had just happened. Back in the main cabin, James and Carla exchanged a quiet glance as they noticed Linda's return. Though her face was blank, her stiff movements betrayed the turmoil she was feeling. Clara, who had been standing nearby, stepped toward her hesitantly. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. Linda shook her head sharply, not meeting Clara's gaze. "Just focus on your job," she snapped, though her voice lacked its usual authority. Clara stepped back, her expression unreadable, and returned to assisting passengers. Meanwhile, James checked his phone again and gave a slight nod to Carla just landed at HQ, he said under his breath. Carla's lips curved into a faint smile. Good, she replied. It's time to wrap this up. The tension in the cabin was thick and the power dynamic had shifted entirely. While Linda struggled to maintain her composure, James and Carla remained calm, quietly waiting for the flight to land and the final act to begin. The plane cruised at 30,000 feet, but the atmosphere inside felt anything but smooth. The whispers among passengers had grown louder and the energy in the cabin was palpable. Clara moved quietly between row, offering water and snacks, her kindness standing out in stark contrast to Linda's earlier hostility. Some passengers, sensing the shift in authority, began openly discussing what had happened in the galley. Linda stood stiffly, pretending to focus on organizing cups and napkins, but her hands trembled with every movement. She replayed the captain's words over and over, the finality of his decision weighing heavily on her chest. Her attempt to exert control over a situation she thought she understood had unraveled completely, and now the consequences were catching up with her faster than she could process. Meanwhile, James and Carla remained seated there, composure unbroken. Carla adjusted the scarf around her neck, her movements deliberate and calm. Do you think she realizes what's about to happen? She asked quietly, not looking at James. She knows something's coming, James replied, his voice low, but I don't think she understands how big this is yet. Carla smirked faintly, picking up the glass of water Clara had given her earlier. She will. A few rows away, the man who had spoken to James earlier leaned closer to a fellow passenger, shaking his head. This whole thing's ridiculous, he muttered. I saw their tickets when they boarded. There was no mistake. That attendant's just, well, I think we all know what this is about. The other passenger nodded, their expression grim. She didn't expect them to belong there, they said softly, and now she's paying for it back in first class. Dennis approached Linda cautiously, his brow furrowed with concern. You're going to need to hold it together until we land, he said quietly, keeping his tone neutral. Making a scene now will only make things worse. Linda bristled but didn't respond. She couldn't bring herself to admit that Dennis was right. Every move she made now felt like it was being watched and judged, not just by the passengers but by the crew, the captain, and perhaps even the people on the other end of the calls coming from headquarters in the main cabin. Carla's phone buzzed softly on the tray table. She glanced at the screen and gave a small nod. They're ready for us when we land, she said to James, her tone measured. Everything is in place. James smiled faintly, leaning back in his seat. Good, he said. Let's make sure this is handled properly. The announcement from the cockpit broke the growing tension in the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be beginning our descent shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened and tray tables are in their upright positions. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. The passenger stirred, the usual rustling of belongings and seat adjustments filling the air. Clara moved through the cabin efficiently, checking seat belts and offering friendly smiles. When she reached James and Carla, she paused, her gaze softening. Is there anything else I can get for you before we land, she asked, her voice gentle. Carla shook her head, smiling warmly. Thank you, Clara, you've been wondering. Full Cla's cheeks flushed slightly and she nodded. If you need anything, just let me know, she said before moving on. Linda, standing just a few steps away in the galley, stiffened at the exchange, the contrast between her own actions and Clara's professionalism becoming more glaring by the moment. As the plane began its descent, the whispers among passengers turned into low murmurs. Everyone had seen the tension between Linda and the couple, and now they were speculating on how it might resolve. Some were openly frustrated, muttering about how unfairly the situation had been handled. Others were simply curious, wondering what would happen once the plane touched down. James and Carla, however, remained silent, their calm presence a stark contrast to the growing unease around them. Carla pulled out her phone once more, typing a quick message before slipping it back into her bag. James folded his arms across his chest, glancing out the window as the City below came into view. Linda on the other hand couldn't seem to stay still. She shifted from one foot to the other, her hands twitching nervously as she pretended to adjust the drink cart. Dennis shot her a glance from the other side of the galley but said nothing. He didn't need to. The look on her face said it all. She was unraveling when the plane finally touched down with a smooth landing. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the cabin, but for Linda the real anxiety was just beginning as passengers began to unbuckle their seat belts and retrieve their belongings. She felt the weight of what awaited her on the ground. The captain's words echoed in her mind, and for the first time in her career she felt completely powerless. Carla remained seated, her movements as calm and deliberate as ever. She glanced at James, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now we wait." James nodded, his eyes locked on the curtain separating them from first class. "She doesn't know it yet," he replied, "but this flight just changed everything for her." The seat belt sign blinked off and the familiar shuffle of passengers gathering their belongings filled the cabin. The usual rush to exit the plane was underway, but the tension lingering in the air kept people moving a bit slower than usual, their curiosity glued to the events of the flight. Some whispered amongst themselves while others openly craned their necks toward the galley to see how Linda, now visibly shaken, was handling the aftermath. James and Carla remained seated unhurried. They watched calmly as passengers filed past, their composed demeanor and unspoken declaration that they were firmly in control of the situation. Carla checked her phone again, the faint light illuminating her face as she read a message. She leaned toward James and whispered, "They in position. She's not leaving." This unnoticed. Linda stood near the galley, her face pale and her shoulders tense. Her attempts to blend into the background were failing spectacularly as her usual air of authority was replaced by nervous fidgeting. Every time a passenger glanced her way she stiffened, her eyes darting toward the exit as if she were already calculating her escape. Dennis, still observing her with a mix of concern and disapproval, finally stepped closer. "You can't avoid this, Linda," he said quietly, his tone even but firm. "It's already out of your hands." Linda shot him a glare, but it lacked conviction. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she muttered, her voice low and defensive. "I was just doing my job." Dennis crossed his arms, his expression unimpressed. "This wasn't about your job. You let your assumptions dictate your actions, and now the whole airline is paying for it. You need to own that." Linda opened her mouth to argue but stopped when she saw the first uniformed security officer step through the door at the front of the plane. Her breath caught and her heart sank. This was it. Her worst fears were materializing right before her eyes. The officer scanned the cabin briefly before speaking to the captain, who had stepped out to greet them. Their conversation was brief but serious, and it didn't take long for the officer's attention to shift toward Linda. She froze as their gaze landed on her, and her attempt to act natural only made her discomfort more obvious. Passengers began to take notice, their movement slowing as they realized something significant was about to happen. A woman standing in the aisle whispered to the man behind her, "Do you think it's about what happened earlier?" He nodded, his expression grim. "It has to be. Look at her, she's practically shaking." Meanwhile, Clara approached James and Carla with a soft smile, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. "We're almost ready to depain," she said kindly. "I just wanted to thank you both for staying so calm during all of this." Carla returned the smile, her tone genuine. "You've been wonderful, Clara Weck. Be sure to mention that when we speak with your leadership." Clara's cheeks flushed and she nodded gratefully. "Thank you. She glanced toward Linda and hesitated. "I just hope everything works out the way it should." "It will," James replied, his voice steady. "It's already in motion." As the last of the passengers exited the cabin, the security officer moved toward Linda, flanked by another uniformed figure. Linda stiffened, her back pressing against the galley counter. As they approached, the captain's presence behind them added an air of finality to the scene. Dennis stepped aside, his face unreadable as the officer stopped in front of Linda. "Are you Linda Scott?" The officer asked, his tone Calm but authoritative. Linda nodded slowly, her voice failing her for a moment before she managed to croak out, "Yes, that's me. We've been instructed to escort you off the plane for questioning," the officer said firmly. "Please gather your belongings." Passengers lingering near the exit turned to watch, their curiosity barely concealed. Linda's face burned with humiliation as she fumbled to grab her things. "This isn't necessary," she muttered, her voice shaking. "I was just following procedure." The officer didn't respond, simply stepping aside to allow her to move. The captain's expression remained stern, his silence a clear signal that he supported the decision. Linda hesitated, glancing toward Dennis, but he simply shook his head and looked away. There would be no help from him as Linda was escorted down the aisle. James and Carla stood there, movements graceful and deliberate. They gathered their belongings without a word, stepping aside to let Linda pass. As she walked by, Carla's gaze met Linda's briefly. There was no anger or malice in her eyes, only a calm, unflinching resolve that made Linda avert her gaze. When Linda finally stepped off the plane, escorted by the officers, the cabin felt lighter, as though the tension had been physically removed. Along with her, Clara exhaled softly, her shoulders relaxing as she turned back to James and Carla. "Thank you both again," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. Carla smiled warmly, her composure unwavering. "You did your job with integrity, Clara. That's all anyone can ask for." Clara nodded, her eyes glistening slightly before stepping away to assist the remaining crew with final checks. James and Carla moved toward the exit, their st kept steady as they prepared to leave. Outside the plane, Linda stood near the security team, her posture stiff and defensive. She glanced toward James and Carla as they exited, but quickly looked away, unable to face them directly. As they walked past her, James glanced at Carla, his voice low. "I think she understands now," he said. Carla nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Maybe," she replied. "But this isn't just about her, it's about making sure this doesn't happen again." James and Carla stepped into the bustling terminal, the hum of activity around them contrasting sharply with the tense stillness they had left behind on the plane. They moved purposefully, there, every step a quiet declaration of control and dignity. Behind them, Linda lingered near the gate, flanked by the two security officers. Her face was pale, her movements stiff as she answered their questions in low, nervous tones. The sight of her hunched shoulders and downcast eyes drew the attention of passers-by, many of whom slowed their steps, curious about what had transpired. Carla adjusted her scarf as she walked, glancing briefly over her shoulder at Linda. "She's rattled," she said softly, her tone even. "It's hitting her now." James nodded, his expression calm but firm. "Good, it needed to, but this isn't over yet." As they approached the baggage claim, a young woman in a crisp suit stepped forward to meet them. Her polished appearance and purposeful stride identified her immediately as someone of importance. "Mrs. Carter." "Mr. Carter," she greeted them with a respectful nod. "My name is Rachel. I'm with the executive team at the airline. Thank you for agreeing to meet with us." Carla extended a hand, her grip firm. "Thank you for responding so quickly," she said, her voice professional but unmistakably resolute. "We have a lot to discuss." Rachel gestured toward a quiet seating area near the corner of the terminal. "If you'll follow me, we've arranged a space where we can talk. We've also escalated the situation to our board of directors as you requested." James and Carla exchanged a brief glance before following Rachel. The small meeting space was discreet but comfortable, with a sleek table and a set of plush chairs. Carla set her bag down beside her as they took their seats. Rachel sat across from them, her notebook and tablet neatly arranged in front of her. "First," Rachel began, her tone earnest, "I want to personally apologize for the way you were treated. What happened on that flight was unacceptable, and we take full responsibility for the actions of our staff." Carla nodded but didn't smile. "Apologies are a start," she said evenly, "but they don't do what happened, and they don't address the bigger issue. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a reflection of a larger problem within your organization." James leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "We've encountered this kind of behavior before, but what happened today was particularly Egregious. Linda wasn't just rude or dismissive, she actively escalated a situation that didn't exist. That speaks to a lack of proper training and oversight. Rachel's face tightened slightly, but she nodded. You're absolutely right, she said, and that's why we've already begun taking action. The employee in question has been suspended pending a full investigation, and we're implementing immediate changes to our training programs to address unconscious bias and customer service protocols. Carla raised an eyebrow, her tone skeptical. Immediate changes are often reactive. What are you planning to do to ensure this kind of behavior isn't ingrained in your company culture? Rachel paused, her gaze steady. We're not just focusing on training, she said, we're also revising our internal reporting structures and accountability measures. Every complaint will be escalated to a central review team to ensure transparency and consistency in how these matters are handled. Carla's lips pressed into a thin line as she considered this. That's a step in the right direction, she said finally, but I want to see measurable results. I want timelines, regular updates, and proof that these changes are being implemented effectively. Words alone won't fix this. Rachel nodded again, her respect for Carla evident. Of course, we'll provide you with a detailed plan and ensure you're kept informed at every stage. As Rachel spoke, James's phone buzzed quietly on the table. He glanced at the screen and gave a slight nod to Carla. It's done, he said simply. Carla allowed a faint smile to cross her lips. Good, she replied, turning back to Rachel. Her tone softened slightly, though it remained firm. We're not here to punish your airline unnecessarily. What we want is accountability and systemic change, not just for us but for every passenger who comes after us. Rachel exhaled, a small note of relief in her expression. I understand, she said, and we're committed to making that happen. The meeting concluded shortly after, with Rachel promising to follow up within the week. As James and Carla walked back toward the exit, the energy in the terminal seemed to shift. A few passengers who had witnessed the earlier events on the plane approached them, offering quiet words of support. One man, the same passenger who had spoken to James during the flight, stepped forward with a nod. I just wanted to say you handled yourself with incredible grace up there, he said. What happened to you was wrong, but you showed everyone how to stand tall. Carla smiled warmly. Thank you, she said. We just hope this leads to something better. As they left the terminal, the events of the flight began to feel like a closed chapter, but Carla knew the story was far from over. What had started as a moment of humiliation and prejudice had transformed into an opportunity for change, a change they intended to see through to the end. The drive away from the airport was quiet, but the silence between James and Carla wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective, weighted with the impact of the day's events. The sleek black sedan moved steadily through the city streets, its polished interior shielding them from the chaos outside. Carla sat upright, her phone in hand, as she scrolled through messages and updates from the airline's executives. Each notification was another step forward, another confirmation that their voices were being heard, yet her expression remained measured, her mind calculating. James glanced over at her, his tone soft but curious. What's next, he asked. They've taken the first steps, but do you think it's enough? Carla tilted her head slightly, her fingers pausing over her phone. It's a start, she said thoughtfully, but what happened today wasn't just about one flight or one person. It's about the culture that allowed Linda to feel empowered to act the way she did. That's the real fight. James nodded, leaning back against the leather seat. You think they'll follow through? Bill have to, Carla replied, her voice firm. If they don't, this won't stay contained to just us. We've already set things in motion. As the car pulled up to their home, a sleek modern townhouse with tall glass windows and clean lines, Carla's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, her lips curving into a faint smile. They're already working on the public statement, she said, showing James the message. They're nervous. James chuckled softly. They should be. They've seen what happens when you're underestimated. Carla smirked but didn't respond. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked toward the entrance. James followed, carrying their Bags with a practiced ease inside the calm and elegant space welcomed them, a stark contrast to the chaos of the day. Carla placed her bag on the kitchen counter and exhaled deeply. "I'll admit," she said, pouring herself a glass of water, "there was a moment up there when I wasn't sure how far this would go, but once Linda called security I knew we had her." James nodded, setting their suitcases near the stairs. "She never expected us to fight back," he said. "She thought she had all the power." "That's the problem," Carla replied, her tone sharp but controlled. "People like her are so used to their authority going unchecked they never expect consequences." James leaned against the counter, watching her carefully. "Do you think she understands now?" Carla took a sip of her water, her expression thoughtful. "She might," she said after a moment, "but understanding isn't enough. She has to feel the weight of what she did, not just today but in the long term, and more importantly the system has to change so no one else gets treated the way we were." James smiled faintly. "You're not letting this go anytime soon, are you?" "Not a chance," Carla replied, her voice resolute. "This isn't just about us, it's about setting a precedent." Meanwhile, back at the airline's headquarters, Linda sat alone in a small, stark conference room. The walls were bare and the only sound was the faint hum of an air conditioning vent above her. The chair beneath her felt stiff, unyielding, much like the situation she now found herself in. The disciplinary hearing had concluded hours ago and Linda was left waiting for the formal notification of the airline's decision. Her mind raced as she replayed the events of the flight, every glance from a passenger, every murmur in the aisle, and every word spoken by James and Carla played back like a loop. She couldn't escape the realization that she had lost control of the situation, not just in the moment but entirely. Not at her. She had thought she could assert her authority and the couple would comply without question. She had been wrong. The door opened suddenly, startling Linda from her thoughts. A man in a gray suit entered, carrying a thin folder. His expression was professional but cold, and he wasted no time with pleasantries. "M. Scott," he began, taking a seat across from her. "The board has reached its decision." Linda sat up straighter, her palms damp as she clasped them tightly in her lap, and she asked, though she already knew the answer. The man opened the folder and glanced down at the document inside. "Effective immediately, your employment with the airline is terminated," he said evenly. "Your actions during Flight 287 violated company policy and exposed the airline to significant reputational and legal risks. The board has determined that this situation warrants dismissal." Linda's chest tightened as the words hit her like a punch to the gut. She opened her mouth to protest, but the man continued before she could speak. "You will receive a formal letter outlining the reasons for your termination, along with instructions for returning your uniform and other company property. Security will escort you out of the building." Linda stared at him, her face pale. "I made a mistake," she said weakly. "I didn't mean for this to happen." "Mistakes have consequences," the man replied bluntly, closing the folder and standing. "You'll have an opportunity to appeal the decision if you choose, but given the evidence in the board stance, I wouldn't expect a reversal." As he left the room, Linda slumped back in her chair, the reality of her situation crashing down around her. She had underestimated James and Carla, and now she was paying the price. Her career, once a source of pride and author, it had unraveled entirely, and as she sat in that empty room she realized that there was no one to blame but herself. The ripple effects of Flight 287 extended far beyond the airplane or even the airline's boardroom. By the time James and Carla had settled back into the routine of their lives, the incident had already become a topic of national conversation. Social media buzzed with hashtags, and videos recorded by passengers began to surface. Clips of Linda confronting the couple, James calmly filming her, and Carla's composed responses were shared thousands of times. Discussions about unconscious bias and the power dynamics in customer service industries dominated online spaces, drawing in voices from across the spectrum. For James and Carla, the attention was both validating and exhausting. They hadn't sought the spotlight, but they recognized the power it gave them to push for change. Sitting At their dining table one evening, Carla reviewed an email from the airline's legal team while James scrolled through news articles on his tablet. "They're already rolling out the training programs," Carla said, tapping a line in the email. "Mandatory sessions for all employees by next quarter. They're also establishing an independent committee to oversee customer complaints." James glanced up, nodding. "That's progress," he said. "But is it enough?" Carla leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "It's a start," she said, "but policies and training only go so far. It's the culture that needs to change. People like Linda need to understand that bias, conscious or not, has real consequences." James set down his tablet and folded his hands in front of him. "Do you think she's learned that?" he asked. Carla considered the question for a moment before answering. "I think she's feeling the consequences," she said carefully, "but whether she's learned anything, that depends on what she does next." Elsewhere, Linda sat in the dim light of her small apartment, the weight of her termination pressing heavily on her. The letter from the airline lay open on the coffee table, its clinical language detailing the reasons for her dismissal. Beside it was her phone, buzzing intermittently with messages from former colleagues. Most were short and curt, expressing disbelief or awkward condolences. Others were harsher, condemning her actions and blaming her for tarnishing the airline reputation. Linda hadn't replied to any of them. Instead, she stared at the screen, scrolling through news stories and comment sections that dissected her actions on the flight. The headlines were: "Brutal flight attendant fired after calling security on black couple with valid tickets," and "Bias in the skies. How one airline faced a reckoning." Her name wasn't mentioned directly in most articles, but it didn't need to be. Anyone who had been on the flight or seen the videos knew who she was, and the comments, those were the worst. Strangers speculated about her motivations, her character, even her personal life. She felt exposed, her mistakes laid bare for the world to judge. For the first time in days, Linda allowed herself to confront the truth she had been avoiding. She had acted on an assumption, plain and simple. She hadn't questioned why she felt the couple didn't belong in first class. She had simply acted believing her position would shield her from scrutiny. It hadn't. Instead, it had amplified her error, making it impossible to ignore. With a deep breath, Linda opened her laptop. For hours she researched articles and watched videos about unconscious bias, diversity training, and systemic discrimination. At first it felt performative, as though she were trying to absolve herself by consuming information, but as she read and listened, something shifted. She began to see herself not just as someone who had made a mistake, but as part of a larger problem, a system that rewarded power imbalances and allowed unchecked authority to flourish. Finally, she opened a blank email, addressing it to the carrier's board. Linda started to type. Her words came gradually from the start, however they picked up speed as she poured her contemplations onto the screen. "To the responsible party in question, I'm writing to officially recognize my activities on Flight 287 and to offer a genuine statement of regret, not simply to Mr. and Mrs. Carter, however to the travelers, team and authority of the aircraft. To my conduct was unsatisfactory, and I assume complete ownership for the damage I caused. While my end was legitimized, I desire to utilize this experience to develop and add to forestalling comparative occurrences in the future." The email was long, intelligent, and crude. Linda didn't avoid her errors, nor did she attempt to move the fault. Rather, she illustrated explicit advances she arranged to take to teach herself and set things straight. When she at last hit send, it felt like a little weight had lifted, insufficient to delete the outcomes, yet enough to venture out toward responsibility. In the interim, back at the aircraft's base camp, Carla's impact was reshaping approaches and needs. The board had carried out her proposed changes, as well as welcomed her to take part in a board conversation on corporate responsibility and client relations. At first reluctant, Carla concurred, perceiving the chance to intensify the message past her own experience. The board occurred at a unmistakable industry gathering, with Carla situated close by. Presidents and variety Specialists. Her quiet however strong conveyance caught the room. The issue isn't simply individual inclination, she said during her introductory statements. The frameworks permit predisposition to work uncontrolled. In the event that we need genuine change, we need to address both. Her words ignited acclaim. Yet more critically, they started discussions that proceeded with long after the board finished. Participants moved toward her, inquiring for counsel and offering support for her endeavors. For Carla, there wasn't actually any need to focus on private acknowledgement. It was about guaranteeing no other person would need to get through what she and James had encountered soon thereafter. As she furthermore, James shared a calm supper at home. Carla considered the excursion. Do you figure we've done what's necessary, she asked. James grinned delicately, going after her hand. We've done what we could, he said. The rest really depends on them. However, I think we've begun something significant. Carla gestured a weak grin contacting her lips. It's not the end, she said, it's simply the start. Also, she was right. Past their feasting table, discussions went on in meeting rooms, instructional meetings, and networks all over the planet. The tale of Flight 287 wasn't just around one couple or one flight. It had turned into a impetus for change, an update. That responsibility wasn't simply a trendy expression, yet a obligation regarding Carla and James that was a heritage worth structure. Weeks turned into months, yet the waves of Flight 287 didn't blur. The story proceeded to resound, turning into a touchpoint in bigger conversations about decency, responsibility, and the predispositions imbued in ordinary associations. News sources returned to the occurrence occasionally, referring to it to act as an illustration of how a singular demonstration could uncover foundational issues. While James and Carla had generally gotten back to their typical lives, they ended up at the focal point of a development they hadn't expected yet readily embraced. For Carla, the work was a long way from being done. She had taken on a formal counseling job with the aircraft, working straightforwardly with their initiative to plan and execute thorough, preparing programs. These projects didn't simply zero in on predisposition, they handled issues of authority, direction, and the significance of clear, fair strategies. Carla's quiet yet firm disposition gained favor with her among the leaders, a considerable lot of whom were at first impervious to the profundity of progress she proposed. One evening time during a show to the load up, Carla remained before a screen showing the airline new rules. Her voice was consistent as she made sense of these measures aren't just about forestalling occurrences like what occurred on Flight 287, they're tied in with making a culture where all representatives feel enabled to act with reasonableness and honesty. That is the way you safeguard your travelers and your brand. The board individuals gestured, apparently connected. Even the more suspicious among them appeared to perceive the worth in her methodology. While the gathering finished, a few chiefs moved toward Carla to express gratitude toward her. Actually, one of them, a more established man who had been quiet all through the vast majority of the meeting, said discreetly, "We've required this for quite a while. I'm simply sorry it took what befell you to uncover it." Carla grinned obligingly. However, her eyes conveyed a calm assurance. "What is important is that it's going on now," she answered, "yet it's doing every one of you to ensure it endures." In the meantime, James directed his energy into archiving their experience. A talented essayist and communicator, he started writing a progression of articles and commentaries for noticeable distributions. In his pieces he composed about what had occurred as well as about the bigger illustrations it uncovered. He featured the calm yet fundamental manners by which suspicions could shape activities, frequently with pulverizing outcomes. His articles started boundless conversation, with perusers sharing their own accounts of predisposition and shamefulness in work environments, schools, and public spaces. One night, as James and Carla sat in their lounge room, James shut his PC with a fulfilled grin. "The most recent piece went live today," he said, going to Carla. "It's now building up some decent forward movement." Carla looked up from her notepad where she had been writing down thoughts for her next project. "What's the point this time?" She got some information about the force of remaining even-headed under tension. James answered, how our response to that circumstance molded the result for us as well as for everybody watching. Individuals misjudge the amount of control they possess in those minutes. Carla gestured mindfully. It's actual, she said. However, it's additionally debilitating keeping cool-headed while somebody questions your entitlement to be where you should be. It takes more strength than individuals acknowledge. James went after her hand, crushing it tenderly. And you took care of it better than anybody might have, he said. However, you shouldn't have needed to. Carla gave him a little grin, her eyes mellowing. That is the reason we continue to push, she said. As much, however, no other person needs to. Across the city, Linda was starting to revamp her life. The cycle was everything except simple. Her end from the carrier had been a public display and viewing as new work had demonstrated troublesome. Numerous potential managers faltered in the wake of finding out about the episode, reluctant to make an opportunity on somebody whose moves had started such discussion. Still, Linda continued. She had started going to studios on predisposition and separation, not out of commitment but rather out of a developing want to comprehend what had turned out badly. She met individuals who shared their own encounters, individuals who had been underestimated, misconstrued or excused in view of what they looked like or where they came from. Hearing their accounts constrained Linda to face awkward insights about herself, bits of insight she had overlooked for extremely lengthy. One day Linda sat in a little study hall encompassed by others going to a workshop on oblivious inclination. The facilitator, a sharp and humane lady, suggested a conversation starter to the gathering. What is one supposition you've made about somebody that you want to reclaim? The room fell quiet, the inquiry hanging vigorously in the air. Linda delayed, her palms perspiring somewhat. Then, without precedent for a drawn-out period of time, she shouted out, I expected somebody didn't have a place, she said discreetly, her voice shaking, not due to anything they did but sense of how I saw them, and it set me back. All that. The facilitator gestured, her demeanor insightful. Recognizing it is the initial step, she expressed. The following is utilizing that attention to improve. Linda acknowledged those words. Over the long haul she started chipping in with associations that zeroed in on value and consideration, sharing her story as a useful example. However, the way was troublesome. It gave her a feeling of direction she hadn't felt in years. She understood that while she was unable to fix her previous activities, she could work to guarantee they weren't rehashed by others back at the carrier. The progressions Carla had supported were starting to flourish. Reports of inclination-related grumblings had diminished, and representatives talked emphatically about the new preparation programs. Clara, the airline steward who had offered grace to James and Carla during the flight, had been elevated to a senior job in her new position. She worked straightforwardly with Carla on executing team instructional courses, guaranteeing that compassion and reasonableness were at the center of each and every connection. On a cool pre-winter evening, James and Carla ended up getting onto one more flight, this time for a merited excursion. As they subsided into their top-notch seats, Carla looked at James, a weak grin. All the rage feels different this time, doesn't it? She asked. James gestured, checking out the lodge. The group moved with effectiveness and incredible skill, their cooperations with travelers warm and authentic. It does, he expressed, like things are beginning to change. As the plane took off, Carla reclined in her seat, shutting her eyes briefly. The murmur of the motors consumed the atmosphere, consistent and consoling. She pondered everything that had happened, the embarrassment, the battle, the advancement, and felt a calm, deep satisfaction. Their process had been nowhere near simple, yet it had been worth the effort. Also, as the plane moved higher out of sight, Carla knew one thing for certain: the work wasn't finished. However, they had proactively had an effect that was enough for presently. Thank you for watching. In the event that you partook in this video, remember to stir things up around town button, share your considerations in the remarks underneath, and buy into the feed for additional accounts like this. See you in the following one.